Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into the shadowy corners of medieval convents to uncover the dark secrets of medieval nuns. The lives of these women were often shrouded in mystery, discipline, and, at times, controversy. Join me as we explore the hidden aspects of their existence that will leave you astounded. The Middle Ages, spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, was a period where the Christian Church wielded significant influence over daily life. Convents were seen as sanctuaries of devotion and piety, but beneath this facade, there were many untold stories and dark secrets. Let's peel back the layers and examine the lesser-known aspects of life for medieval nuns. Medieval nuns adhered to a rigorous daily schedule filled with prayer, work, and study. The structure was designed to keep them constantly occupied and focused on their spiritual duties. The day typically began before dawn with matins, followed by lauds, and continued with other canonical hours throughout the day and night. This relentless schedule aimed to cultivate discipline and devotion. While this might sound peaceful and orderly, the strict discipline often masked a harsher reality. Many convents practiced the rule of silence, where nuns were only allowed to speak during designated times or for specific purposes. This rule was meant to minimize distractions and encourage contemplation. However, it also led to feelings of isolation and mental strain among the nuns. Power dynamics within the convent could be as complex and corrupt as in any secular institution. Abbesses, who held significant authority, sometimes abused their power for personal gain or to exert control over other nuns. These abuses ranged from favoritism in the allocation of tasks and privileges to outright corruption and manipulation. In some instances, favoritism and nepotism were rampant, with abbesses promoting relatives or friends to positions of influence within the convent, creating an environment of tension and resentment. An abbess wielded almost absolute authority within her convent, and this power could corrupt. Some abbesses accumulated wealth and lived in relative luxury compared to their sisters. This stark contrast between the abbess's lifestyle and the vow of poverty taken by nuns often led to discontent and unrest within the community. One notorious example is the Abbey of Fontevraud in France, where abbesses wielded immense power and wealth, often living in opulence that starkly contrasted with the supposed vows of poverty and humility. The abbesses of Fontevraud were known to exercise considerable influence over the local economy and politics, using their position to amass wealth and exert control. In some cases, the power of the abbess extended to legal matters, where she could adjudicate disputes and even administer punishment. This judicial power was another area ripe for abuse, with abbesses sometimes using it to settle personal scores or maintain their authority. Some convents engaged in the Sale of Indulgences, a practice where the church claimed to reduce punishment for sins in exchange for monetary donations. This controversial practice was not only a source of income but also a significant moral corruption within the church. The Sale of Indulgences exploited the faithful's fear of damnation and desire for salvation, turning spiritual solace into a profitable enterprise. Indulgences were meant to offer spiritual benefits, reducing the time souls spent in purgatory. However, their commercialization turned them into a commodity, leading to widespread abuse. Convents that participated in this practice often did so out of economic necessity, but the moral cost was high. The revenue generated from indulgences was sometimes used for the maintenance and expansion of the convent, but there were instances where the funds were misappropriated. This misuse of spiritual authority for financial gain contributed to the growing disillusionment with the church, eventually sparking movements like the Reformation. The secluded and hierarchical nature of convent life sometimes provided cover for sexual abuse and exploitation. Vulnerable nuns, especially novices who were young and inexperienced, could be preyed upon by those in positions of power. There are documented instances of nuns being sexually exploited by priests, bishops, and even fellow nuns. These acts were often covered up, with the victims suffering in silence. Sexual abuse in convents was a taboo subject, rarely discussed openly. The victims had little recourse, as reporting the abuse could lead to severe repercussions, including expulsion from the convent or worse. The secrecy surrounding these abuses perpetuated a cycle of victimization and silence. Despite vows of chastity, there were numerous instances of nuns engaging in secret romantic and sexual relationships. These affairs were not limited to interactions with outsiders. Sometimes, they involved fellow nuns or priests. Such relationships, if discovered, could lead to severe punishments, including expulsion from the convent or even harsher ecclesiastical penalties. The confinement and emotional intensity of convent life sometimes led to the development of deep emotional bonds, which could evolve into romantic or sexual relationships. These relationships were strictly forbidden and, if discovered, were met with harsh punishments. One of the most infamous cases is the Nun of Watton in 12th century England. This young nun, coerced into the convent against her will, became involved with a lay brother. When their affair was discovered, the punishment was brutal, with the nun being imprisoned and the lay brother castrated. The affair and subsequent punishment highlighted the severe consequences of violating the vow of chastity. The Nun of Watton's story also sheds light on the lack of agency many women had in choosing their religious vocation, often being forced into convent life against their will. Scandals involving nuns sometimes became public, tarnishing the reputation of the convent and the church. These incidents were often used by critics to attack the moral integrity of the clergy and religious institutions. Scandals could range from financial misconduct to sexual improprieties, and when they became public, they damaged the church's reputation and undermined its moral authority. Public scandals were rare but devastating. When news of misconduct within a convent broke out, it often led to inquiries and interventions by church authorities. These scandals provided ammunition for critics of the church, who used them to argue for reform or even to justify breaking away from the Catholic Church altogether. The church's response to these scandals varied. Sometimes, it involved swift action to remove and punish those involved. Other times, efforts were made to cover up the incidents to protect the church's image. This dual approach often led to further disillusionment among the faithful. Nuns often practiced severe forms of physical penitence, believing that suffering brought them closer to God. Self-flagellation, wearing hair shirts, and other forms of self-inflicted pain were common. These acts of penitence were meant to purify the soul but often led to severe physical and psychological damage. For those who broke the rules, punishment could be harsh. Solitary confinement was a common penalty, where nuns were isolated in small, dark cells for extended periods. This was intended to force repentance but often resulted in severe mental distress. Scandals involving nuns sometimes became public knowledge, causing significant upheaval within the convent and beyond. These incidents were not merely private matters but often ignited broader debates about celibacy, religious discipline, and the integrity of the church. Public perception of such scandals varied widely. While some viewed them as evidence of moral decay within religious institutions, others sympathized with the human complexities and emotional needs that these women faced, despite their vows. The exposure of scandals could tarnish the reputation of entire religious orders, leading to scrutiny from ecclesiastical authorities and secular leaders. Convents implicated in scandals often faced interventions aimed at restoring order and discipline. The Nun of Watton's case, for example, prompted ecclesiastical authorities to impose stricter regulations on convent life and reinforce the vow of chastity among nuns. It served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing personal desires to overshadow spiritual commitment. Those involved in forbidden relationships faced not only legal repercussions but also severe spiritual consequences. Accused of breaking sacred vows, they risked excommunication and eternal damnation. The severity of punishments underscored the Church's stance on maintaining the purity and sanctity of religious life. The fear of divine retribution and public shame often weighed heavily on those tempted to engage in illicit relationships within the cloistered confines of the convent. In the medieval period, the fear of witchcraft and the supernatural was pervasive. This fear extended into the cloistered life of nuns, where accusations of witchcraft could emerge from personal vendettas, misunderstandings, or even the nuns' own mystical experiences. Within the isolated and often secretive environment of the convent, any unusual behavior or unexplainable events could quickly lead to suspicions of witchcraft. Accusations of witchcraft were sometimes driven by personal rivalries or envy among the nuns. A nun who exhibited extraordinary abilities, whether in healing, knowledge, or spiritual experiences, could become a target for those who felt threatened or jealous. These internal conflicts could quickly escalate, leading to serious accusations. One notable example is Sister Benedetta Carlini, an abbess in a 17th-century Italian convent. Benedetta claimed to have visions and mystical experiences, which initially garnered her considerable respect and influence. However, her increasingly erratic behavior and the discovery of her sexual relationship with another nun led to her being accused of fraud and demonic possession. Benedetta was ultimately imprisoned within the convent for the rest of her life. The fear of witchcraft led to harsh interrogations and torture to extract confessions. Nuns accused of witchcraft could be subjected to brutal methods to force them to admit to their supposed crimes. These confessions, often obtained under duress, reinforced the belief in widespread witchcraft and further fueled the cycle of fear and persecution. The use of torture to extract confessions reveals the extreme measures taken to combat perceived threats of witchcraft, often resulting in false admissions of guilt and severe punishment for the accused. In addition to fears of witchcraft, accusations of heresy posed a significant threat to nuns who strayed from orthodox beliefs or practices. The Church maintained strict control over religious doctrine, and deviations were met with harsh consequences. Some nuns experienced profound mystical visions and claimed direct communication with the divine. While these experiences were sometimes celebrated, they could also attract suspicion if they deviated from accepted theological norms. Marguerite Porete, a French mystic and Beguine, authored The Mirror of Simple Souls, a mystical text that was deemed heretical by church authorities. Although Marguerite was not a nun, her case illustrates the dangerous intersection of female religious experience and accusations of heresy. Despite her profound spiritual insights, Marguerite was burned at the stake in 1310 for her beliefs. The case of Marguerite Porete highlights the fine line that female mystic walk between divine inspiration and heresy, with the latter often leading to fatal consequences. Accusations of heresy could also arise from unorthodox practices or teachings within the convent. Nuns who engaged in practices that deviated from established religious norms, such as unconventional forms of prayer, fasting, or even medical practices, risked being labeled as heretics. Sister Antoinette Berignon, a 17th-century Flemish nun, promoted a form of mystical Christianity that emphasized direct communion with God over traditional church sacraments. Her teachings attracted a following but also drew the ire of church authorities. Accused of heresy, she spent much of her life fleeing from persecution, highlighting the precarious position of those who challenged orthodox religious practices. The Church actively censored and suppressed texts deemed heretical. Nuns who wrote theological works or mystical accounts risked having their writings banned and destroyed. This censorship extended to the confiscation of books and manuscripts within convents, aiming to prevent the spread of heretical ideas. The suppression of texts reveals the lengths to which the Church would go to maintain doctrinal purity, often stifling intellectual and spiritual exploration within the convent walls. The Inquisition played a crucial role in identifying and prosecuting heretics, including nuns. Ecclesiastical trials were conducted to root out heretical beliefs and practices, often leading to severe punishments such as imprisonment, excommunication, or execution. Sister Jeanne d'Angers, a 17th-century French nun, became infamous during the Loudun possessions, where she and several other nuns claimed to be possessed by demons. The subsequent investigation and trials led to the execution of a local priest, Urbain Grandier, who was accused of witchcraft and causing the possessions. Jeanne's case exemplifies how accusations of heresy and witchcraft could intertwine, leading to dramatic and deadly outcomes. Convents, like other medieval communities, were not immune to disease. Epidemics such as the Black Death swept through these cloistered environments, causing widespread death and suffering. The close quarters and often poor sanitary conditions made convents breeding grounds for illness, leading to high mortality rates among the nuns. The intense isolation, rigorous discipline, and sometimes harsh treatment led to significant mental health issues among nuns. Anxiety, depression, and even cases of what we might now recognize as psychosis were not uncommon. Some nuns experienced mystical visions or stigmata, wounds resembling those of Christ's crucifixion. While these were often seen as signs of divine favor, they also attracted suspicion and sometimes led to accusations of heresy or witchcraft. The line between sanctity and suspicion was thin, and those who exhibited extraordinary spiritual phenomena walked a precarious path. Saint Catherine of Siena, a 14th-century mystic, experienced visions and received the stigmata. While she was ultimately canonized, her life was marked by periods of intense scrutiny and skepticism from church authorities. Some convents developed macabre practices related to death and the afterlife. Ossuaries, or bone chapels, where the skeletal remains of deceased nuns were displayed, served as grim reminders of mortality and the fleeting nature of earthly life. These practices, while intended to inspire piety and reflection, often bordered on the eerie and morbid. Convents were not isolated from the broader political struggles of their times. Power struggles within convents could mirror those of the secular world, with factions vying for control. These internal conflicts could lead to significant turmoil, affecting the spiritual and daily lives of the nuns. In 14th century Spain, the convent of Santa Clara was embroiled in a bitter dispute between factions supporting different abbesses. This conflict drew in external political forces and led to years of instability and strife within the convent. Some nuns, particularly abbesses of prominent convents, wielded significant influence in secular politics. They acted as advisors to rulers, managed extensive properties, and even played roles in diplomatic negotiations. The intersection of religious and secular power sometimes placed these women at the center of significant political events and conflicts. As we've seen, the lives of medieval nuns were far more complex and fraught with challenges than the serene image often portrayed. Behind the convent walls, there were stories of power struggles, forbidden desires, harsh punishments, and accusations of heresy and witchcraft. These dark secrets remind us that the medieval convent was a microcosm of the broader human experience, filled with both devout faith and profound imperfections. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the hidden world of medieval nuns. If you found this exploration fascinating, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold stories. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.